Hey everybody, welcome back to Absolutely PlayStation and Steam Gamers. I'm Dylan, that's Houston, that's Shank, and we got a little bit of a discussion topic based on some stuff that we talked about in the podcast earlier this week. So I was playing the Control DLCs, and one of them takes place after, like, the game ends, and also the second one that takes place during when the game is supposed to not end came out after, so I played both of them after I finished the game. That confusing verbiage aside. And they both kind of end on like a not super exciting note, which is different to like the actual game's ending, which I don't really like, but it has like the gravitas of what like a game ending should have, or just any ending really. But the two DLCs kind of just end in like a womp womp, like you did it, okay.
Well, Womp, good
job. Here's a gold sticker.
Yeah, like wait 4 years for the sequel to Alan Wake to come out, and then you can maybe get back into this world. So the question that I wanted to ask you guys is, do you think story DLCs that come out after a game like ends, after the game is released, and adds on to the story, do you think that undercuts the original game's ending, especially if they don't have like another like huge ending to the game?
I think it depends on the game, and exactly like you said, if there's no real big whoa, wow, like it can ruin the game for me. I feel like that made zero sense now that I'm
that makes sense
rethinking.
To me.
But
So Hugh, you're kind of riding the fence, right?
yeah, it depends on the game. So there's games that DLC has come out for that just add to the, and then there's ones that are like, hey, remember all that stuff you did? Rewind.
Right.
This was all before that.
That's kind of how I feel about Horizon's DLC, because I played that technically like a year or two after it came out because I wanted to finish my ultra hard New Game Plus run before I got to the DLC, and that took me a while to do just because I was lazy. But like I liked the DLC, but it didn't feel like because they made a decision to have it take place definitively during Aloy's journey and not after the game ends. That kind of like pulled me out of it. But I think Shank, you brought this up a couple podcasts ago, is like if you play that while you're playing the game for the first time, like it was always there, then it works a lot better, which I think I agree with.
So since Hughie's kind of taking the fence, I will kind of go on the side of no, it doesn't undercut it as long as it's done well. And when we're talking about Horizon Zero Dawn, for example, I think that was done well because there was a narrative reason why you were doing it. It made sense why that area was secluded because it's up in the mountains, it's out of the way. It made sense narratively that the god of creation is not necessarily as important as the god of the apocalypse, like the god of...
Sure.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Like, to me, it didn't undercut what we did in the original. The original boss was trying to revert everything to zero. This guy just wanted to kill humans and was just trying to make angry robots and make the robots take over. So I don't necessarily think it undercut anything. And aside from like story-wise, gameplay-wise, I got to play more of my favorite game with new monsters,
for
new
sure,
robots, new whatever. So I think it's almost like a multifaceted question because if you're really enjoying a game, you'll take any reason to play more of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's how that particular game was for me. That's also an outlier because Horizon's one of my favorite games, so I really enjoyed playing that game and would take any excuse to play more of it after I beat it. For kind of middle of the road games, I could see where you guys are saying, like, yeah, if it's not executed well, it could definitely undercut it. But
so that brings up another discussion. Why should I play it at launch if I know there's DLC that they're going to add that's in the middle of the story instead of just waiting for the complete edition that will come out a year or so later once everything's been released?
Hot take, you shouldn't. You should wait a year.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly.
Because there's so many other games to play.
Yeah.
It's not like,
Most people in our I feel like most people do wait to play games anyway. Like people watching this podcast and us obviously kind of jump on games pretty soon. But like Control is a good example. I didn't get to that until like a couple weeks ago, and that came out in 2019. So that I got that with all of its DLC. I still played the DLC after in the order that they were released. That's not true. No, yeah, I did. I played them in the order released. I was confused because one of them takes place after the game and one of them takes place during the game. It is an interesting, it's kind of a loaded question because it really depends. It's kind of a case by case basis. Cause something like I considered, when Spider-Man PS4 came out, they announced their DLC almost immediately. And they said it was going to be 2 DLC packs that were going to take place after the game ended. And I don't think I ended up actually doing this, but I considered waiting the month between the 2 DLC packs just so I could play them all in one sitting, which I feel like I should have done.
Well, here's another point. It also depends on when the DLC is chronologically taking place.
yes.
If it's taking place a year or two after the game, I have no problem with DLC coming out and just saying, "Hey, this is what is happening in between 1 and 2."
Yeah.
I think the bigger issue is, and I remember we talked about this on another podcast, but the worst game for this was Final Fantasy 15.
Oh, God, yes.
They cut story out, took it out. There's a big gap in the story. You play it through, you feel unsatisfied with what you got originally. And then they sold it piecemeal back to you over the course of 5 or 6 different expansions.
Yes.
And then when you get to the end, you're like, oh my God, the story is actually really good. Or if you dove deep into the lore, you're like, okay, this story is actually really good, but you shouldn't have to do that. I should be able to buy the whole package.
Right.
I agree
when
100%.
it comes out.
Because you can clearly see in that game where those DLCs were cut and took place.
Right. It's like Gladio's just like, yo, I'm going to peace out for a while. Yeah. Ignis goes missing for a while. I forget
then it comes
why
back
Prompto.
blind.
Why did Prompto leave?
He falls off the train.
Prompto falls off the train and then he meets back up with you.
Yeah.
So it's like,
That's bizarre.
it's like I know what you're doing. This is uncomfortable. Why are you doing this to
purposefully
me?
ripping content
They
out.
definitely took it the farthest, I think.
Mm-hmm.
To that
Yeah.
gray, not even the gray line. That's over the
No.
fence for me. That
Right.
they should not have done
Right.
that.
The gray line is what Spider-Man did. The gray line is, do you announce DLC when your game is coming out? Why not just delay the game and have that as part of the game?
Well, right, but didn't the whole Black Cat saga happen after the resolution of the game?
Yeah, but it was shortly after. And Spider-Man is a good example of that because I think the game came out in September of that year, and then the DLC was December and January.
And it was saying a couple months later, hey,
yeah,
hey,
that's
Spider-Man's
fine.
getting into cahoots with Black Cat, and I'm that type of thing. I feel like is executed better. This isn't a part of the story we were telling. You know what I mean? Versus we broke up the story we were telling to sell you that later.
Right.
I didn't have an issue with Spider-Man per se, but that's only one example.
Yeah.
I mean, another one that did it well, I think. I didn't play it, but everybody that tells me, I think you said you played it, is The Witcher 3.
The Witcher is the perfect example of how to do DLC well.
Yeah.
Because your base game was an epic story that spanned hours and hours of playtime, deep lore, great game, good gameplay.
Decent gameplay. It wasn't the great. That's what keeps getting me drawn out of it is
Same. Don't like the
just
gameplay.
don't like the sword play.
Yeah, it's not the best.
Yeah.
It's not the best. It's not that, for me, it's the game loop of solving a mystery, tracking the monster, killing the monster, or a person, depending on if the monster's a person or an animal. But going back to what we were talking about with DLCs, the entire base game is an epic. It's a story of trying to find Ciri and reuniting with her and what happens with the Wild Hunt. Heart of Stone has nothing to do with that. Heart of Stone could be its own separate spin-off like indie game, if that makes sense.
I believe you can actually just start that game or the expansion without going into the game.
You can, but it's like I was talking about with Dylan, where you'll walk over there and all of a sudden level 40 enemies are hitting you while you're level 20.
Or is it Blood and Wine? One of them you can literally start your game. Just they're like, hey, go play this instead.
I think it's Blood and Wine.
It might be Blood and Wine.
Blood and Wine would make more sense because Heart of Stones is basically what they did. There was this huge map of Velen and Novigrad. And then in the northeast corner, they added this entire extra section. That's all where Hearts of Stone happen. You do occasionally go back into Velen, but not a lot. Most of it's happening up in this corner on the main map. And it tells a very succinct, like good, fascinating story. And then it's done. That's why I said it could be its own like standalone spin-off, because it's the same game mechanics, it's the same character, I should say. There weren't a whole lot of crossovers from the base character, but it could be its own little thing. And it doesn't undercut any of what you did with the Wild Hunt. It's just like, no, like Geralt obviously went back to witchering after this epic story happened. And this is another crazy adventure he got into.
Right.
Now, Blood and Wine should have been its own damn game. Now, I'm glad it wasn't, because it's good that CD Projekt Red was willing to give us that as just a DLC. That was like 40 hours of gameplay for me. An entire new map. And by map, I'm not talking about like a multiplayer like Destiny or Overwatch map. I'm talking... It was the size of one of like the base maps in the game. Its own completely separate story. Its own completely like separate. Just everything was unique. The tone felt different. Everything. And then not only that, it almost served as like an epilogue for what happened in the main game. And at the end, you kind of get this like nice, like, well, you could get multiple endings. That's part of what makes The Witcher great. But there are these like really nice, like epilogue, like happy endings you can get at the end of the game. And it just kind of cemented it as like, I think that's what cemented it as an iconic game. Because it feels like you're experiencing a story all the way through. Then you get another entirely separate story, and then at the end, it feels like you've come back around and you're satisfied with what happens. And I think that's what you were talking about with Control. You just weren't satisfied with what happened at the end.
I already wasn't really satisfied with Control's ending, like the base game's ending. So to get like 2 DLCs that don't even really have an ending, like they just kind of fizzle out. And I will say that AWE, the second one, the Alan Wake one, has more of a like I don't even think the Foundation has like a cutscene at the end. It just kind of ends on some dialogue. But the AWE has like a cutscene, like a big like, oh, and it's basically a teaser trailer for Alan Wake 2, which got me less excited because I haven't played Alan Wake, which I'm planning to do now, but. It like if I had played Alan Wake, I'm sure I would have been like, "Whoa!" But I was not. So, but I had a couple more examples that I think have you guys played Dark Souls and or Bloodborne?
Yep.
I have them on my PlayStation ready to play, but I haven't gotten to them on my backlog.
Okay.
I've played and beat all of them.
Cool. So, Dark Souls, I think Dark Souls versus Bloodborne's DLC is, I think, interesting for this because they're kind of on opposite spectrums. Where, in my opinion, Dark Souls' DLC is fantastic. They're both fantastic DLCs, but Dark Souls is a game that ends on like a kind of really epic moment. If you've been paying attention to the story, you know who you're fighting, and it ends in like a cutscene with multiple endings. But then if you do the DLC after, which you don't have to, you can do it in the middle of the game, but if you do it after, then it just ends on a boss fight. And it's a hard boss fight, but it's not like the most difficult thing in the world, and it's way more cryptic than the boss fight that you actually end Dark Souls on. And then Bloodborne's kind of the opposite, where like you play the ending of Bloodborne and you still get that multiple endings cutscene once you beat the final boss. But the final boss of Bloodborne's DLC is quite possibly the hardest boss in any Souls game. And the DLC like leading up to it is just such like a fun ride that like that's like a satisfying ending. Once you beat that boss, it's like like you like, and there's not even really a cutscene for that. But you beat it and you're like, you've probably been at it for hours and hours at that point. And it's way more satisfying than I feel Dark Souls' DLC was on. So
I think the biggest problem with the Souls games DLCs is they can be done whenever.
yeah.
And the story is so hidden in the games that to some people it's just more boss fights. Like they don't care about the story. It's just, hey, more bosses.
That's what I was going to say, because in last week's discussion we were talking about how far is your lore hidden away versus like right up in your face, and Benny used Dark Souls as one of the examples, or like Dark Souls Bloodborne as an example of hiding your story away in the lore of everything. And at that point, I feel like the only way to get a satisfying conclusion is to have a difficult boss. Because if you're not invested in the story because you have to like read the lore for it, then seeing a cutscene like after the boss fight, if the boss fight was super easy, isn't going to be exciting. But if you just spent 2-3 hours perfecting every part of that fight and then you finally beat it, then you get that sense of satisfaction. That I think, unless you're telling a very cinematic story like God of War or Horizon Zero Dawn, you don't get that if your story is hidden away. If your story is hidden away, it has to be gameplay related. That's how it's satisfying.
And I think that's why, like, going back to the root of the question, like, Control's DLCs, like, Control is a very story-driven game. It's a lot of fun gameplay, and it does have a lot of deep lore in it. But it, like, the endings to those, like, one of them ends on a big boss fight, and Control's boss fights aren't great. The enemy, like, the normal enemy encounters are a lot better in that game than the boss fights are, just because of how the combat system works. But they both, I don't even see, this is a problem. I played the Foundation like 4 days ago and I don't remember how it ends. Like,
That's
think
always
it
a
might
good sign.
Yeah, right. I think it might end on a boss fight, but I'm not certain. I don't remember. I know AWE ends on a boss fight because like during it you're tracking the boss like the whole time that you're about to fight at the end. But yeah, I don't remember. And that's the issue, is it's just, I think that is really what it comes down to, is just like a game will undercut the story's original ending if it's not a satisfying ending itself.
Right. Whether that's narrative or gameplay wise.
Gameplay, yeah.
I mean, it has to be one or the other, or both.
Both would be great.
Both is great. I would say The Witcher 3 is probably both. I think.
Yeah.
And again, that's probably why so many people like that game, is because the narrative was good and the gameplay. I mean, the gameplay for that game was mediocre,
decent,
but it was the best that the gameplay was. It was the best type of boss fight you could get for that type of gameplay, for that gameplay loop. So,
well, I think we came to a pretty good meet in the middle here. I mean, the answer is it's like a case by case question. Like you really can't say yes or no to this.
Did they execute? Did they properly execute the DLC? No, then it's unsatisfying and it undercuts your ending.
If it's bad DLC, then it's probably not. Which I'm not saying Control's DLC is bad, but it like Control itself doesn't end well.
It's not as satisfying as the base game was. It has to be more satisfying than whatever happened in the base game.
I agree.
Yep.
Cool.
100%.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks for watching our discussion video for this week. Stay tuned next week. I'm Dylan. That's Houston. That's Shank. We're gonna be back. I might not be back. We have rotating hosts. Who
Somebody
knows?
will be here.
I'll be back.
Somebody will be here, even if it's just Shank alone with Grogu. Who knows?
Talking to Grogu, discussing it.
Alone with Grogu.
We'll see. All right. Check y'all next week.
Bye.
See you.